All right, before we get to the phrase digital nicotine, let's slow down and get the case on the table. In late March, a Los Angeles jury found Meta and Google liable in a landmark social media harm case brought by a 20-year-old plaintiff known as Kaylee G.M. The jury awarded a total of $6 million in damages, $3 million compensatory and $3 million punitive, and split responsibility 70 to 30, with Meta bearing the larger share. The jury found both companies negligent in designing or operating their platforms, found that negligence was a substantial factor in harming the plaintiff, and found they failed to adequately warn about the risk. Now, one thing that can confuse people right away is the age issue. Because the plaintiff is 20 now, so if you hear that too quickly, it sounds like an adult user case, but that's not really what the jury was looking at. The core allegation was that the harm took shape while she was still a child, using YouTube from age 6 and Instagram from age 9, and that the platform's risks to young users were foreseeable enough and ignored enough to create liability. And that matters because this wasn't just some vague social media is bad for kids culture war argument. The legal question was narrower and more dangerous for the platforms. Not did bad things happen on the internet, but when does engagement design stop looking like a feature and start looking like a product defect? That's the hinge. Because once a jury is willing to say, yes, these design choices were not just sticky, not just engaging, but negligent, and not just in some abstract sense, but negligent enough to justify both compensatory and punitive damages, you're in a different frame now. You're no longer just arguing about self-control, you're arguing about duty, foreseeability, and product responsibility. Now, to be fair, the defense position wasn't crazy on its face. Meta and Google argued that mental health problems are complex, adolescence is complex, family life is complex, and you can't just draw a straight line from a platform to a person's suffering. And yes, that part is true. Complex harms usually do have multiple causes. Reuters' trial coverage made clear that the companies pointed to other life experiences and family circumstances as relevant context. But that's also exactly why this case matters. Because this episode isn't really about whether social media is good or bad, innocent or evil in nature. It's about something more specific. When does design become responsibility? What incentive system produces that design? And why is the phrase digital nicotine suddenly landing so hard right now? All right, so let's talk about a phrase that got very sticky over the last couple of weeks: digital nicotine. Mashable's line, syndicated through Yahoo, was blunt. Quote, "We didn't grow up on social media, we grew up on digital nicotine." End quote. The point of that phrase isn't subtle. It's trying to move the conversation away from bad habits and towards something closer to engineered dependency. And yeah, I know, that's a loaded metaphor. It's supposed to be. But a good metaphor can do two things at once. It can clarify something real, and it can also smuggle in conclusions you haven't fully earned yet. Nicotine is a chemical dependency story. Social media is messier. It's reward loops, social comparison, notifications, infinite scroll, algorithmic uncertainty, and network effects. So no, it's not a one-to-one match. But that doesn't mean the metaphor is empty. I think what it gets right is this. The argument is no longer just that social media is distracting. The argument is that certain design features may be functioning like deliberate dependency infrastructure. And the plaintiff side in this case leaned hard into exactly that. Reuters reported that the case focused on features like infinite scroll and the company's alleged knowledge of risks to younger users. It also reported testimony and internal documents around how the companies approached youth engagement and safety trade-offs. Translation: this is not just people happen to get sad while using apps. The legal theory is sharper than that. It's you knew enough about the risk profile of the design, especially for minors, and you kept optimizing the machine anyway. And once you say it that way, a lot of features start looking different. Infinite scroll doesn't look like convenience, it starts to look like friction removal in the service of compulsion. Autoplay doesn't look like user friendliness, it starts to look like momentum engineering. Likes, notifications, recommendation loops, those stop looking like innocent engagement features and start looking like a system that keeps nudging a developing brain back into the loop. Now, scientifically, this is also where things get slippery. There still is not a settled, universally accepted standalone clinical diagnosis called social media addiction. Nature ran a piece this month making exactly that point. Many scientists are still reluctant to use the term too cleanly because the methods and diagnostic guidance are still limited. But, and this part matters, that does not mean there is no problem. The WHO Regional Office for Europe says problematic social media use among adolescents rose from 7% in 2018 to 11% in 2022, and it describes that pattern using addiction-like symptoms, loss of control, withdrawal, neglect of other activities, and negative consequences in daily life. So the honest version is, no, the science does not give you a simple courtroom sentence like social media is literally nicotine. But it absolutely gives you enough to say there is a growing pattern of problematic use, it has recognizable behavioral features, and the product design question is no longer something you can wave away as moral panic. And that's why I think this case matters more as a responsibility case than as a psychiatry case, because courts do not need a perfect DSM label to ask a more basic question. If you know your design predictably amplifies compulsive use in minors, and you know that's tied to harms, what duty do you have to stop optimizing for it? That's a much more dangerous question for the platforms. There's also a more cynical reaction to all of this, and I think it's worth taking seriously. Once you get a verdict like this, a very normal question shows up in people's heads. Okay, does this mean anyone can now blame social media for whatever went wrong in their life and try to get paid? And honestly, I get why people ask that, because mental health is complicated, family life is complicated, adolescence is complicated. So on the surface, it can sound like we're sliding toward a world where every personal failure, every stretch of bad judgment, every period of low self-control gets repackaged as platform harm. But that's not actually what these cases are doing, at least not when they survive serious judicial scrutiny. What's changing is not that courts suddenly believe platforms cause everything. What's changing is that courts are increasingly willing to look at platforms as active designers, not just passive containers. And you can see that outside California too. In New Mexico, a jury ordered Meta to pay $375 million in a child safety case, and Reuters reported that the state then openly discussed pushing for product changes, things like tighter age checks, limits on recommendations to minors, restrictions on notifications, and even restrictions on infinite scroll for children. In Massachusetts, the state's highest court allowed the Attorney General's youth addiction lawsuit against Meta to keep going and ruled that Section 230 does not wipe out claims focused on Instagram's design itself rather than on user-generated content. Reuters said the court framed the case as one about Meta's own conduct, exploiting developmental vulnerabilities and allegedly misleading users about safety. That matters, because it means the legal system is starting to draw a line between you hosted harmful content and you built a system that predictably amplified harm. And that second claim is much narrower than social media ruined my life. It's also much more dangerous for the companies. So, yes, will this make more people think maybe I can sue too? Of course it will. Reuters has already reported that the California verdict is just one bellwether in a much larger pile of litigation, thousands of related suits in state and federal court. But that doesn't mean everybody suddenly has a winning case. The bar is still higher than "I use this product too much and now I'm unhappy." The real shift is that the law is getting more comfortable asking a different question. Not "did the platform cause everything?" but "was the platform's design a substantial enough factor? And was that risk foreseeable enough to make the company answer for it?" And once that argument shifts from "this product is merely risky" to "this design may be legally answerable," the regulatory conversation changes too. In the UK, Ofcom and the ICO pressed major platforms including Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, Snapchat, YouTube, and Roblox to strengthen age checks, keep underage children off their services, reduce contact from strangers, provide safer feeds, and stop testing new features on children. Reuters reported that regulators gave firms until April 30th to explain how they would comply and threatened serious enforcement, including large fines. That's not the same thing as saying social media is tobacco, but it is the kind of move you make when you're shifting from a parent control framework to a product standard framework. And that shift is a really big deal because once regulators and courts start treating addictive or compulsive design as a product problem, the logic doesn't stop neatly at Instagram and YouTube. Then people start asking harder questions about the whole attention economy. What about short form feeds in general? What about certain games? What about AI companions? And what about systems that learn your vulnerability profile and optimize retention around it? And eventually you collide with the business model itself. Because here's the ugly little structural problem underneath all of this. If your revenue depends on ad impressions and time spent, and if some of your most profitable engagement comes from keeping users, especially young users, in an emotionally sticky loop, then there is a real tension between user welfare and business optimization. You can add parental tools, you can add reminders, you can publish teen safety blog posts. But if the machine still gets rewarded for maximizing attention, the center of gravity doesn't really move. That's the part I don't think enough people say plainly. This is not just a content moderation story, it's an incentive architecture story. And to me, that's why the phrase digital nicotine took off. Not because everyone suddenly became a neuroscientist, not because everyone carefully worked through the epidemiology, but because the phrase gives ordinary people a way to say something they already feel. This does not look like a neutral tool that I happen to misuse. This looks like a system that is very good at making me stay. Now, one more bias to call out just so I don't pretend I'm above it. The most vivid cases always dominate the imagination. A teenager using apps for extreme hours, then ending up in court is vivid. A jury award is vivid. Digital nicotine is vivid. And vivid examples are useful, but they can also flatten the full distribution of outcomes. Not every teenager becomes clinically distressed. Not every heavy user is a damaged user. And even WHO's own materials distinguish problematic use from heavy but non-problematic use. So the serious version of this conversation is not like social media ruins everyone. It's closer to there is now enough evidence, enough legal traction, and enough regulatory movement to stop pretending these platforms are just passive pipes. That's the threshold that seems to be changing. And maybe that's the bigger story here. Not whether digital nicotine is the perfect phrase. It probably isn't. But whether we've crossed into an era where platforms can no longer hide behind the old line that they merely host behavior, while the behavior is being shaped, amplified, and retained by design. Because if that wall starts to crack, then this isn't just one verdict in Los Angeles. It's a sign that the liability map of the internet may be moving. All right, that's it for this one. And honestly, I'm curious where you land on the metaphor itself. Does digital nicotine clarify the issue for you, or does it oversimplify something that's already messy enough? Either way, that's the frame battle now. Not just whether social media is good or bad, but who carries responsibility when the design itself becomes the story. Last but not least, thank you for being interested in this kind of question. Questions about design, incentives, responsibility, and how systems shape people long before people fully understand what's happening to them. If this episode gave you something to think about, hit like. If you disagreed with it or think I'm missing something important, drop a comment. I'm genuinely curious where you land on it. And if you want more conversations like this, subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.